I am delighted to welcome everyone to a late afternoon of discussions about Hans Joas's recently translated book, The Sacredness of the Person, A New Genealogy of Human Rights. That was published as a paperback, which is a hint that it can be actually purchased because it even has a reasonable price. It was published by Georgetown University Press in 2013. This event is co-sponsored by Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago, represented by its executive director, Thomas Levergood, back there, and the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago, which I represent as faculty director. I am Michael Geyer, and I am a historian of German and European history. The cooperation between the two institutions may come as somewhat of a surprise if we think of one as a distinctly religious and the other one as a distinctly secular unit associated with the university. But the inaptness of this juxtaposition and how it can and should be replaced is exactly what we are going to debate this afternoon. But I will say no more, because we have in our midst a distinguished panel to start up the debate, and we have the author of the book, Professor Hans Joas, who will kindly provide introductory and concluding remarks. Let me introduce the speakers and the panelists. Professor Hans Joas is known to many of you as professor of sociology and of social thought, at the Committee of Social Thought, but you may not fully appreciate that he is, and you have to take this tongue-in-cheek, not legally speaking, he is moonlighting here at the University of Chicago, because he is concurrently, well, I should say, he has just abandoned a good Catholic southern town, Freiburg, in favor of the fame and fortune, some would say the flesh pots, of the big city of Berlin, where he is now a member of the theological faculty of Humboldt University, as the Ernst Troeltsch Professor for the Sociology of Religion. This is quite an extraordinary honor. Humboldt University is once again a leading university in Germany, and obviously having a professorship in the name of Ernst Troeltsch is something very special and very unusual. His main work concerns social thought and the theory of war, question of values, theory of religion, the theory of sociology, and all of this in more than an armful of books and countless essays which you can actually get on his website. Our interlocutors are from the right, John Kelly, who is professor of anthropology and member of the board of the Human Rights Program. His interests have lately turned to sports, specifically baseball, if I see that correctly. But his earlier work is on the anthropology and the question of war, once again, and war and counterinsurgency at that, the anthropology of Fiji and post-coloniality, law and state-making, and need I add, it is on the question of value as exemplified in his early monograph, A Politics of Virtue, Hinduism, Sexuality, and Counter-Colonial Discourse in Fiji. Ben Laurence, next to him, is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and also a member of the board of the Human Rights Program. He is the one you will discover with Aristotle with a bicycle helmet on his website. A bicycle helmet obviously indicating that philosophy, and above all his special orientation, political philosophy, is a dangerous thing indeed. There is also, I should say, a snorkeling Leibniz, if I see this correctly, and you may want to make an interpretation as you see fit. He has written on Kant, on practical philosophy, on question of responsibility, and interestingly, and this links him with a train of thought in Hans Joas, an essay on Elizabeth Anscombe. He is working on an account of the ideal just political community. Last but not least, next to me is Bill Schweiker. He is the Edward L. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor of Theological Ethics and Director of the Marty Center for the Advanced Study of Religion here at the University of Chicago in this very house in the Divinity School. He has written widely on questions of ethics, among other things, in the context of a globalizing world, on hermeneutics, on comparative religion, and I'd say more than an armful of books, of heavy books at that, in the past few years. I would like to mention only one, to bring to you the kind of connection to this panel, Humanity Before God, Contemporary Phases of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Ethics in 2006, which brings him into the circle of experts to comment on Hans Joas's book on the sacredness of the person. And with this, please do welcome Professor Hans Joas, who will make some introductory remarks.
Good afternoon, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm very happy that this symposium about one of my books takes place. And so first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Michael Geyer and to Thomas Levergood for organizing the symposium, and to you, Michael, also for your kind words of introduction. I consider it a very great honor that one of my books has been singled out for this purpose. Now, a few words, quarter of an hour, about my book. It is a book on the history of human rights and on the importance of that history for the normative debates about human rights, or as you could say, for the justification of the basic idea of human rights. Now, one of the specificities of the book is that it deals with a connection between these two questions. It is neither an attempt at an ahistorical kind of justification of human rights, as some philosophers might do or might think and find appropriate, nor is it a merely empirical, historical reconstruction of the history of human rights in an allegedly value-free fashion. The book, maybe because of this connection, but maybe also for other reasons, has proven to be very controversial, at least in Germany, where all the major newspapers have had reviews of it, but with a whole spectrum of evaluations, from very positive and laudatory to devastating. There are even 2 discussion volumes on the book. One is already out, a purely theological volume, and another one, a more interdisciplinary volume, is coming out in July. And that keeps me busy also, writing long responses to the critics for all these volumes and review symposia. Now, it's not really surprising that such a book is controversial, I think, because so many things in the area of human rights are deeply controversial. And I will just mention 3 such controversial points, because that helps me perhaps to characterize my book a little bit. The first point that is controversial already is, when does the history of human rights begin? The answers to this question are extremely different. My book takes the late 18th century as its point of departure. The reason for that is that in the late 18th century, I think we have the first, let's say, codifications of the idea of human rights, legal, quasi-legal codifications in the French Declaration and in the preceding American declarations. So in that sense, when you see the history of human rights, to some extent at least, as a legal history, I think you have to start in the late 18th century. Now, some of the critics say, but this history is much longer. The beginning of this history is much deeper in the past. For example, they say the history of human rights starts with the Gospels, or with the religious breakthrough in ancient Judaism, or with ancient Greek philosophy, or with the axial age, to bring also the Indian and Chinese developments into the picture. Still, others say the history is much shorter. It doesn't even make sense to start it in the 18th century. It would be better to start the history of the human rights in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or as a group of younger German and American historians claim, even later, let's say in the 1970s with Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, because on the real high point of the Cold War, human rights didn't play such a great role. I think all these critics have a point, but it helps to distinguish between, let's say, religious and philosophical ethics that can be characterized as being universalistic. And then we have to talk about the axial age, Greek philosophy, and so on and so on. And the other group of critics also has a point, namely by emphasizing the role of human rights in foreign policy, and particularly in the foreign policy of the most powerful state in the world, namely of the United States. But from my point of view, since I neither focus mostly on political questions, nor mostly on philosophical and religious questions and ethical questions in this sense, but since I have this focus on the legal codification of human rights, I think starting in the late 18th century makes a lot of sense. Second controversial point, what is the relationship between two terms that are often used almost interchangeably in the discussions about human rights, namely human rights and human dignity, or universal human dignity? In my eyes, the term human rights signals legal changes, whereas the term human dignity signals cultural processes of value change. Now again, I'm mostly interested, of course, in the connection between these two levels, you could say, but it would be too easy to assume that legal changes are always the outgrowth of processes of cultural transformation. No German would defend that, I think, because the constitutional changes in Germany after Nazism clearly, did not emerge bottom up, so to speak, but top down, and so such processes can happen, they can be successful. But I'm not a legal historian, despite the emphasis on legal change, but interested in legal changes as part of wider, of more profound processes of cultural transformation. And the third controversial point I'm going to mention is the relationship between history and justification. I chose as a title of the methodological chapter of the book, neither Kant nor Nietzsche. And that maybe was not a wise decision, because Kantians and Nietzscheans are some of the most powerful groups of at least German, maybe internationally, philosophers. So I kind of alienated both very influential groups of philosophers. So some well-meaning colleague told me I should have called the chapter Kant plus Nietzsche. And then I would have had positive reactions from both groups, but it would have been rather dishonest, of course, to accept that proposal. I do not even know what Kant plus Nietzsche would exactly mean, and so the main reference figure in this methodological chapter is indeed Ernst Troeltsch, who was mentioned in the introduction. So the book is a book about the history of human rights since the 18th century that considers the history of human rights mostly as a process of profound cultural transformation, but cultural transformation with, in some cases at least, legal consequences, and it tries, under this label of affirmative genealogy, to combine arguments aiming at processes of the genesis to arguments aiming at the validity of these arguments. Now, empirically speaking, I have studied 4 cases, 2 of a more, if one can say that, punctual character, and 2 of a more drawn-out character, namely, on the one hand, the codifications of the late 18th century and the codification of 1948 in the Universal Declaration. These are the 2 punctual things. The 2 drawn-out processes are the abolition of torture in Europe in the 18th century and the abolition of slavery in the United States in the 19th century. I mentioned the 4 empirical cases also in order to fend off the possible criticism that this is not a complete history of human rights. It certainly is not a complete history of human rights. There is nothing in the book, or hardly anything in the book, about the history of human rights after 1948. And mentioning the abolition of slavery in the United States already makes clear that one could, of course, do research and write chapters on the history of the abolition of slavery, let's say, in Brazil or Cuba. So it's highly selective. And I do not even claim that the 4 stories I'm telling are part of one ongoing process. My claim is these are 4 different stories. Of course, let's say in later phases, people can refer back to earlier such stories. But that, whether they do that or not, is an empirical question. So my claim is not, and I'm saying that because I know that I'm sometimes misunderstood in this way, that there is one ongoing process of the sacralization of the person. There is no teleological claim involved at all. But now the important thing I have to come to is, of course, why do I speak about a sacralization of the person or the sacredness of the person at all? The trivial answer would be because one of the founders of sociology invented this expression. Émile Durkheim in 1898 published a piece related to the famous Dreyfus scandal in which he was defending the idea of human rights as a sacralization of the person. Actually, he was a little bit vacillating between speaking about the sacralization of the person and the sacralization of the individual. I have decided to speak about the sacralization of the person because the term sacralization of the individual can easily be misunderstood, as some of you will know from the literature in the sociology of religion, that today, at least according to some sociologists, there are tendencies in the direction of a self-sacralization of individuals, that when you ask individuals what they consider sacred, they might say the only thing I consider sacred is I myself. Now that's not what I have in mind when I'm speaking here about the sacralization, and that is why I chose this notion of the person. But why sacredness? I think one cannot understand the main message of my book if one is not aware that there was a rich discourse about sacredness around 1900 and in the first decades of the 20th century. And the crucial idea, articulated very well by Durkheim, was that the sacred should not be seen as something that is derived from religions, existing, institutionalized, doctrinal forms of religion, but exactly the other way around, that the sacred is constitutive for religion. So the basic idea is that there are intense human experiences. I call them in my books on the Genesis of Values and in the book Do We Need Religion, experiences of self-transcendence, experiences in which we are drawn beyond the boundaries of ourselves. And when we have such experiences, that we tend to attribute a certain quality to elements of the situation that have led us to have this experience. And the notion for this quality, for the attribution of an extraordinary quality, is sacredness. If you follow this line of reasoning, it should immediately be clear that this attribution takes place with regard to all sorts of, let's say, secular entities. Durkheim himself was certainly thinking of the history of French nationalism or nationalism in general in the 19th century as a sacralization of the nation. Something people are willing to sacrifice their lives for. But many other things can be sacralized in this sense. The sacred is never simply there, it's always in flux. Even the whole system of sacralization can change, can be transformed. For example, in what I mentioned before, the axial age, when ideas about transcendence came up. The fact, however, that many people associate this, let's say, scientific use of the term sacred too easily with religion leads them to avoid the language of sacredness. That happened, for example, when the German Constitution was drafted. The German Constitution begins with the statement, Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. The dignity of man is now. The first proposal, as one can show, was to say ist heilig, is sacred. But the Social Democrats at the time, of course, said, never. We will never accept that the Constitution speaks about holiness or sacredness in this connection. So they tried to find a term that has more or less the same meaning as sacred, but that doesn't sound so religious. And they almost invented a term. Some people say it was not really a common word in the German language in 1948. The word unantastbar, it's translated as inviolable, but if you take it literally, it means something that shouldn't be touched. Now, the ironic thing is, of course, that for Durkheim and others, it is a quality of sacred objects that they should not simply be touched. So it is very close to the meaning of sacredness. And let me, just to avoid misunderstandings, and about to finish, but say others who know that I'm Catholic think this is a kind of Catholic inclination to speak about sacredness. My response to that is the four most important contributors to the discourse about sacredness in the early 20th century were two French Jews, Émile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss, the Lutheran Archbishop of Uppsala, Nathan Söderblom, and the Lutheran theologian in Marburg, Rudolf Otto. So it doesn't sound very plausible to assume that this is a kind of secret Catholic message that I'm trying to transport. Now, in the book, with this emphasis on experience, I try to do justice both to what one could call the positive experiences, where you are filled with enthusiasm, and the negative experiences of violence, both as a victim and as a perpetrator of violence. Now, one more minute. So my main interest is in the articulation of such intense experiences. In that sense, the articulation of the intense experience of the sacred. I'm fully aware that most of these articulations are not, let's say, fully articulate. Of course, I mean, let's say objects that are being sacralized have a certain aura, or persons have a certain charisma, and we cannot really say what it is. But in some, maybe rare cases, we articulate our intense experiences in the form, now I say it in a Habermasian language, in the form of propositional statements about the good. I think it is good or it is evil to do this or not to do this. And then we can talk about values as such statements about the good. I emphasize the connection to the experiences because I think in many cases we can have a purely, let's say, rational debate about statements about the good, but we often reach a point where the debate doesn't go further, and at that point to include the experiential foundation can be helpful. So I'm ending by saying if this is true, this changes our views on the role of religion in the history of human rights. It does not make sense to think that there is some religion, for example Christianity, that in the course of 1,700 years, through a process of maturation, somehow leads to the codification of human rights, nor does it make sense to deal with that history mostly as an anti-religious or anti-Christian history. In the commitment to the values that are connected to the sacralization of the person, there can be mutual understanding of proponents of different religious traditions and of religious and non-religious people. So the book ends with a plea, I would say, for a possible coalition of moral universalists, whether religious or non-religious, against particularists, whether religious or non-religious. Okay, thank you.
I'd also like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the Lumen Christi Institute and the Human Rights Program for sponsoring this event. I'm very pleased you could all come to listen as we celebrate the arrival of the English translation of Hans Joas' deliberately challenging book, The Sacredness of the Person. And no doubt we're going to do so in the classic University of Chicago fashion by debating its ideas. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for the sponsorship. I want to begin first with an orientation, which I'm going to call looking over William James's shoulder. I intend to, in my share of these remarks, to focus on the project announced in the book's subtitle, A New Genealogy of Human Rights, and to think about the affirmative genealogy for human rights that Professor Joas renders. In a few words, Joas tracks human rights from a pre-revolutionary American quest for religious freedom through the more worldly Declaration of Independence, and then reconsiders the French announcement of rights of man and citizen in this American light. Not the usual story of Enlightenment secularization, but rather anti-clerical insistence on the sacredness all the more imminently located. This affirmative genealogy goes on from there, but I'll finish here. That's all as far as I'm going to get in my comments, actually. With some notes on the striking concept of affirmative genealogy itself, which is a very interesting concept, neither, as you heard, neither Kant's nor Nietzsche's, and clearly the antithesis of Foucault's reworking of genealogy. The very process whereby, in these terms, history not only happens, but as, say, Georg Simmel might have put it, something unfolds in history and is affirmatively maintained. Professor Joas here hunts big game, to switch metaphors, a method that is a sociology of history and also the ground for belief, no less, in universal values and an extant, immanent, sacred. So there are very, very fundamental challenges here. I had not read this book or known much about its author before agreeing to participate in this discussion, and I was intrigued immediately, and I hope to contribute something useful here. My own disciplinary location and intellectual inclinations are rather different. I'm an anthropologist steeped in Boasian, Weberian, and Bakhtinian thought, more comfortable by far with the particular and with cultural relativity than is Professor Joas, though, like Ruth Benedict, I'm actually philosophically more skeptical and plenitist than actually morally or epistemologically relativist, a plenitude of possible real goods, but that doesn't mean anything goes. By themselves, such differences between two intellectuals are not interesting. So seeking a means to read and reread carefully Professor Joas's argument, I turned to a tried and true method and studied intensively the book's index. This method of reading had advertised itself to me ever since I discovered in a volume of Emerson's papers that he referred to Hegel far more often than he did to Harvard, despite the fact, you can see how I noticed, right? Despite the fact that he was at that point standing as a trustee and overseer of the latter. Finally, I had found the means to understand Emerson, and by this critical connection, in fact, the post-dialectical roots of American pragmatism. Not a feather in his cap, call me macaroni. There's actually a post-Hegelian kind of kernel. For another example, Walter Benjamin's lack of curiosity about America is striking if you study his indexes. Mr. Paris, capital of the 19th century, and Berlin, capital of the 20th, Benjamin cites or quotes Victor Hugo 158 times in the Arcades Project. Only Marx and, of course, Baudelaire cited more. Herman Melville, not a single time. Not even once. So, to remember Melville, is the world a ship on the voyage out? Benjamin has nothing on this for us. We will never know shades of Sholem Gershon versus the secular critical readers of Benjamin, whether he would have quoted Melville's whole classic New England line, which you see cited on only some websites. The world's a ship on the voyage out, the pulpit at its prow. Often you only hear the first half. For Hans Joas, there is no Walter Benjamin necessary, but very much indeed an interest in American pragmatism, along with Ernst Troeltsch, Immanuel Kant, Émile Durkheim, and of course Max Weber. William James is among the most cited touchstone scholars in the book. Not for Professor Joas tarrying with the negative. James is cited more than Foucault or Habermas or Nietzsche. Despite this critical engagement with those towering figures, and for example in the chapter you already heard about, Joas seeks an affirmative genealogy, and a Jamesian American social theory is very much part of his apparatus. To explain the form and content of my response to this argument, my respect for it, and my willingness to engage its genealogy affirmatively, though not slavishly, let us therefore begin looking over William James's shoulder. James expounded vigorously on the limitations of two impressive intellectual predecessors in their efforts to reform Christianity and the social-political world. In the Varieties of Religious Experience, William James was pensively critical of Leo Tolstoy and John Bunyan, neither of whom is of use to Professor Joas here. James wrote, quote, "But neither Bunyan nor Tolstoy could become what we have called healthy-minded. They had drunk too deeply of the cup of bitterness ever to forget its taste, and their redemption is into a universe 2 stories deep." End of quote. Tolstoy saw, according to James, Tolstoy saw almost everywhere infamies, spuriousness, cruelties, and meannesses. And again, to quote one more line of James, Bunyan also leaves this world to the enemy. Here is a signature strength aligning Hans Joas with William James. Whether or not Joas will go as far as James towards plurality of actual experiences of the sacred, he absolutely joins James in his determination to a healthy relationship with being in the world. Not for Joas the Émile Durkheim hoped to cure, nor disenchantment, let alone a dismal reign of chance or a world of will to power. Letting Troeltsch and James mitigate the ambivalences of Weber, Joas impressively seeks a Weberian sociology that synthesizes with Mead's scientific iteration of American pragmatism, and at the same time he, in an impressively justified affirmative genealogy that realizes human rights by teachable recognition of the sacredness of the person. If I wanted to indulge my own capacity for skepticism, we could begin with questions about the late arrival in this text, of questions about the world outside the West, its tendency to cite Europeans even when discussing and assessing the views and perspectives of people elsewhere, and even the viability of a framework that universalizes human rights mainly by way of lending others to enter into an originally European framework. But I actually don't want to dwell there. I don't want to proceed by way of skepticism. I do not think this thoughtful book deserves it, and I think that in the spirit of affirmative genealogy, it is a better idea to add to the realities it traces than to criticize particular emphases. In other words, and to put it more fundamentally, I actually have no problem with core propositions here, that human rights are connected to personhood that is now sacred, and that among the roots of that institution, many are Western, and some of the most important are specifically Christian. For the rest of my remarks, I want to illustrate how we can, as I see it, improve this affirmative genealogy by adding more strands to it. I will work with elements already embraced and important in Professor Joas's argument, specifically first, Durkheim on the sacred, and second, the theory and practice of human rights in revolutionary America. So now our middle section is on affirmative genealogy, sacredness. Hans Joas finds in Durkheim a strong ally in the assertion of continuing centrality of the sacred. Joas sides with Durkheim against withering critique from Habermas. Against Habermas in the assertion of desacralization as a feature of modern communication, against the image of a gradual withering away of ritual practices and sacred statuses, against the idea of a contrast, above all, against the idea of a contrast dividing sacredness from rationality, Hans Joas correctly sees in Durkheim a strong theory of profound development of the theory and practice of personality, the rise of the human person as a sacred object. Indeed, as Durkheim so famously argued in his image that, as he put it, man is double, human beings transcend themselves when they think and act, and increasingly recognize the transcendental character and importance of their own subjectivity. Here, however, I must suggest a plenitist addendum to the affirmative genealogy. I know that this might disturb the argument of building necessity, but as much as I like the image of affirmative genealogy, I have to add that the more we push the structures to ground their meanings, the more we will find not singular elementary forms, but an unraveling of our truths back in time, like the fraying strands of a rope. And here I think Durkheim's tight chains of causal development would more resemble Professor Joas's models than my own, but I'm certain that Durkheim would not recognize his own theory of the sacred in all of Joas's uses and revisions of it. In one of the few arguments in the book I find simply uncompelling, Joas claims that, quote, Durkheim did not provide a proper theory of sacralization, end quote. I think it closer to the facts to observe that Durkheim's theory of sacralization is far stranger and does not accord with Professor Joas's genealogy. Joas himself reports Durkheim's theory of sacralization clearly. To quote him, quote, Durkheim's thinking is informed by William James's idea, which is true, that in the first instance religious faith must be understood not as a cognitive event in which we believe something to be true, you heard a version of this already, but as a sure sense of the presence of a great force and experience, a force on which our own vital life force in turn relies. We spontaneously ascribe the quality of sacredness to objects when we have an experience so intense that it constitutes or transforms our entire worldview and self-understanding. The components of the experiential situation are associated with the cause of this intensity. Sacred objects then infect other objects, thus spreading sacredness, end quote. Now I want to amplify two dimensions of what I've just quoted and go deeper into Durkheim's argument here. First, despite Hans Joas's particular interest in the soul and its freedom, as a link in the affirmative genealogy of human subjects, Durkheim is clearly, and in fact strangely, much more interested in objective than subjective entities, entities and forces. Durkheim considers social facts as things, including this force and the objects that make that force transcendently meaningful, which is, of course, society. Second step, in the other late texts written by Durkheim, Durkheim provides a general conceptual name for the general class of things that become sacred, long before people become sacred. Durkheim, in his revision of Rousseau, saw a first general class of things emerge as sacred and thereby ground claims of right and duty. The first sacred things to Durkheim are not subjects but objects, and their general name is property. The appearance of sacred things in the mundane world is that Rousseauian moment rewritten by Durkheim when someone can claim ownership and exclusive right over something and has other people believe it. Way back to genealogy, way earlier in Durkheim's genealogy, of course, than the 18th century. But to Durkheim, the event is more positive than it was for Rousseau. The birth of claims of right as much as of prohibitions. Well, later Rousseau is closer. And to Durkheim, it had nothing to do with labor, the giving of form to material, deployments of force, or any practical interest or reasons. In his late lectures on the nature of morals and of rights, Durkheim insisted, in very much the mode of affirmative genealogy, that property absolutely does not begin with either labor or exchange, contra Smith, Hegel, and Marx. Long before there are contracts or exchanges of property, there is a sacred basis for property being property, to quote Durkheim. To Durkheim, the first property was born in rites. In ritual settings, special and meaningful things apart. Property begins by its unavailability. Thus, as you might have noticed, Hans and I were talking about this before the session. I'm like, yes, Durkheim's theory of the sacred starts with unavailability. It's withdrawal from circulation, marked by ritual status, such as in the Pacific taboo. Everyone's home and land was restricted ethically to family use, and only with the development of patriarchal institutions downstream from this original sacred object, Durkheim argued, did any human agent develop the right to transform or dispose of property. Many more valuable properties, such as, after all, the Chiringas of the Elementary Forms book, were inalienably collective property and thereby precisely withdrawn from general use or even sight. To Durkheim, the rise of individuals with powers to move, change, or alienate property were developments of relationships of production and exchange that followed long after the original arrangements of peoples and things created the situations making more mundane properties possible, contracts only recognizable in a social field already coordinated by ritually renewed positions and relations. And to summarize, because I don't want to run out of time, language then becomes the way you mark the sacredness of the transaction that enables the transfer of the sacred characteristics of the known property. Thus, one could title Durkheim's theory of property Civilization and its Contents, or Civilization and its Contents. But the two senses of content, contentment and composition, involve two different pronunciations in English. And apart from this infelicity, the idea of contentments of civilization would be just as thin an image of the moral benefits of society from Durkheim's point of view as is the famous translation, Civilization and its Discontents is a thin rendering of the tragedy of frustration depicted by Freud. We do not have time to fully explore the strangeness of Durkheim's late in life attack on Kantian philosophy, of which the most important published piece in his lifetime was the attack on the critique of pure reason and specifically the real genealogy of the apparent a priori concepts that you may know from the opening of Durkheim's Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. As Jane Geyer's recent research on Durkheim's late collaboration with Paul Falconet suggests, his final goal may well have been a revision of Kant's deontology, his moral philosophy. I'm not a philosopher, so I will merely wonder if the recently debated trio of possible ethical philosophies, deontology, consequentialism, and virtue theory, all tend to share Freud's and not Durkheim's ontology, a self somehow existing before or apart from society with choices like whether to throw a lever, conscious of relations, some kind of contract or transaction with exterior bullying hegemons. And being stout, I take personally elements of the trolley problem. Durkheim and Falconet's model is as insistent on the exterior grounding of ethics as any consequentialism, and as interested in virtues as any virtue ethics, and as attuned to positivities of duty as is Kant. But they do not accept the willing actor as the analytic premise of ethical description. The party of the first part in their depiction is rather to consider social goods as things. Free will certainly exists because it is built into human agents, a realization of a telos to be sure, but the product necessarily of the movement of good things of the world, things inspiring people to transcend their animal selves in new kinds of action and interaction, in the first instance via rights, not deals or exchanges or production of new material assemblages. I think it likely that Durkheim would have been content to find human rights resident in human souls, which is perhaps the core issue in Professor Joas's affirmative genealogy. But skipping ahead, Durkheim would nonetheless begin with social facts and social goods and rights as things. When Durkheim called something sacred, we can now see that he really meant it. When he argued in the conclusion of the elementary forms of the religious life that the old gods were dead, but that our moral mediocrity was also destined to be a mere transition, he was more hopeful. Durkheim's timeline was very unusual. Unlike Smith, Kant, Hegel, Marx, and myriad other social theorists who put human society now at or near the end of history, Durkheim placed his society in the middle, and he believed in the existence of meaning, a world of evolving meanings, and he meant evolving. His last page of the elementary forms declared the finis naturae, the ultimate creation of nature, to be not man, as he put it, but society. Social and moral facts, and not the biological human, are to Durkheim the apex of evolution on our planet. Durkheim would thus have no problem accommodating in that evolving society, say, interspecies relationships and other species participating in the good, not only associating but even being constituted. And there's something important there. But Stephen Jay Gould would remind us that evolution doesn't really have an apex. But I'm going to leave aside the rest of my Durkheim comments and come to my second, much shorter observation of an additional strand. So, second, the American pragmatic consciousness of history, or making things right and making humans right. Briefly, then, let me finish with some observations about American novelty. To be plain, meaning 18th century American novelty. To be plain, I have no doubt of the solidity and value of Hans Joas's core observation that the consequential attentiveness to liberty in America was born in a religious praxis, even a quest originally for a specifically religious freedom, which explains well the Americans' overdetermination of their own shining future as the ends justifying many means. But in Weberian style, I want to call a final prominent witness to notice also something more developing in the American story, highly relevant to the new kinds of right, human right that could trump the divine right of kings in some specific circumstances, as they put it, in the course of human events. Whence this consciousness of a course of human events, this space larger than the scope of affordances already constituted by divinely sanctioned patriarchs? Let us simplify the point to consciousness of history and claims of right made by John Adams. And I want to notice, in short, that Adams, as a colonial subject, doesn't fit into Frantz Fanon's universe. Fanon told us that European colonists knew they were making history, but thought they were making the history of the mother country. Where Adams, in fact, goes through a step process I'm about to show you, which is a lot more complicated than that. John Adams's political polemics began in such a mode as when the young man thundered against the Stamp Acts that violated the British Constitution and ancient Whig principles that guaranteed rights to all Englishmen. But by 1768, Adams began to write to his wife Abigail about the zeal in his heart for my country, the New England, as against the mother country. By 1771, he found American independence inevitable, but worried, as he wrote to Isaac Smith, that you and I will be saints in heavens before the times we dream of. I'm in the last paragraph now, I promise. When the 1773 Tea Party was followed by the 1774 Coercive Acts, John Adams wrote to Abigail melodramatically, "We live, my dear soul," he wrote to her, "in an age of trial." But he assured her, "Don't imagine from this that I am down in the dumps. I can truly say that I have felt more spirits and activity since the arrival of this news than I had done before for years." By this point, John and Abigail Adams were carefully copying their letters into books that they saved for posterity, despite the obvious risks of the treason inherent in them, imagining well their high historic value. My final point, then, is about this consciousness of space-time and history-making and its relationship to cognizance of relations between divine and human right. John Adams wrote to Abigail in 1774 that, quote, "The question seems to be whether the American colonies are to be considered as a distinct community so far as to have a right to judge for themselves when the fundamentals of their government are destroyed or invaded. This right to judge depended on the existence of a distinct community, not transcendental souls or personalities. The community, not the soul, was the ship on its voyage out." Adams wrote to Abigail, "America is a great unwieldy body. Its progress must be slow. It is like a large fleet sailing in the convoy." So was the pulpit at its prow? Perhaps. But in the end, John Adams was the anti-Benjamin when it came to seeking the wellsprings of agency in the course of events that were, in fact, thoroughly human. As he also wrote to Abigail, moderates in his midst in the Continental Congress were misguided, as he put it, quote, "waiting for a Messiah who will never come," end quote. Not just as they pleased, to be sure, but John and Abigail Adams were, in fact, aware of themselves as people who made their own history, and actual futures were to be relied upon to vindicate that transcendental power. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to be commenting on Professor Joas's The Sacredness of the Person. The project he undertakes in this book is vital, I think. Since human rights are a historically specific and bounded subject matter, to understand them, we must grasp the historical conditions through which they have arisen. To do this is to provide a genealogy of human rights. We are, of course, familiar in the work of Nietzsche and Foucault with genealogies of seemingly universal values that serve a skeptical function. Such genealogies undermine the justification of the values that are their subject by penetrating the false veil of their self-understanding. Professor Joas is interested in an account of the genesis of human rights that might serve the opposite role of positive genealogy. This would be an account of the genesis of human rights that could be affirmed by someone without undermining, indeed, while supporting her commitment to the dignity and equality of the person. There is, of course, no shortage of teleological triumphalist narratives about the genesis of human rights. Professor Joas sketches two such foils for his own view. The first is a crude Enlightenment genealogy that finds in human rights the triumph of reason over religion. On this view, the history of human rights is the story of the progressive emergence of humanity from superstition and parochialism to the universal equality of reason. The opposing count is an equally crude Christian genealogy that sees the seeds of human rights present from the beginning in Christian doctrines, only coming to flower thousands of years later in regimes of human rights. Professor Joas does an excellent job complicating and calling into question the hoary historical tales that seem to support such tidy views. He proposes a more nuanced alternative that suggests a different and subtler relation between human rights and religion than either of the narratives he overturns. Following Durkheim, he argues that human rights flow from a conception of the sacredness of the person. Now, thought about the sacred is, of course, intimately tied to religion or intimately related to religion. As Durkheim says when offering his famous rough definition of religion, he says, "Religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things." Religion is, as it were, the original system of the sacred, the first historical home of the concept. But, as Joas argues, now I'm quoting him, the term sacralization should not be understood as having an exclusively religious meaning. Secular content may take on the qualities characteristic of sacrality, namely subjective self-evidence and affective intensity. Sacredness may be ascribed to new content. It may migrate or be transferred. Indeed, the entire system of sacralization that pertains within a culture may undergo a revolution. The key idea of this book, he says, then, is that the history of human rights is a history of sacralization, the history of the sacralization of the person. So Professor Joas's claim is that the genesis of human rights involves a migration or transfer of sacredness from organized religious practice to a new object, the human individual or person. So there is, after all, some kind of relation between human rights and religion, but it's not the relation depicted by either of the grand narratives. Human rights represent neither the supersession of religion by reason, nor the teleological development and fruition of religious doctrines. Human rights rather involve a transfer of meaning organized by religion, originally, beyond the boundaries of religion to the human person. Obviously, the genesis of human rights will only be the sacralization of the person if the meaning of human rights is that the person is sacred. So everything turns on whether or not this claim is true. It is important, I think, that we distinguish the sacredness of the person, at least initially, from what is less controversial. Sorry, you'll see throughout, I'm playing the role of the philosopher, but also of the German socialists, I think, who objected to this way of forming things. That's my role in this panel. So I think it's important that at least initially we distinguish the sacredness of the person from what's less controversial. And I have in mind the thought that the regime of human rights involves an elevated status for the human person, expressed naturally in the connection of human rights with dignity. As Article 1 of the Universal Declaration tells us, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. To value human rights is to think that this rather remarkable status extends to all human beings and places us under requirements of justice to one another. The question is, does this more neutral description amount to thinking of the person as sacred? Or that's the question I'm trying to ask. To evaluate this claim, we must know what it is to think of something as sacred. Luckily, Professor Joas provides an explicit account of this. He holds that to think of something that is some value as sacred is to satisfy two marks with respect to it. The first is what he calls alternately subjective certainty or subjective self-evidence, and the second is affective intensity. Since it's with these marks that we get to the heart of the matter, I would like to spend some time trying to unpack them. Because Professor Joas does not linger over this definition, what I offer here is somewhat conjectural, and it's intended as a suggested proposal that he's welcome to either adopt or reject, perhaps providing an alternative. So let me start with the first mark, subjective certainty or subjective self-evidence. So certainty can be used as a synonym for knowledge. For example, a climate scientist might say, here's what we're certain about. Data shows conclusively that the Earth is getting warmer. What we don't know is exactly how much this process will accelerate over the next 3 decades. Here, certainty is being used to mark the difference between what's known and what's unknown. However, there is one crucial difference between knowledge and certainty. Knows is what philosophers have called a factive verb. One can say that X knows that P only if P is true. I can only know what is a fact. By contrast, to be certain is not or not always a factive verb. So although I can't know something and yet be mistaken about it, I can be certain of something while erring. For example, I can be certain that I promised I would meet you at 3 o'clock, when in fact I'm misremembering and I actually promised to meet you at 2. I think this may be how Professor Joas intends us to understand the subjective and subjective certainty, or perhaps this is just my deflationary reading, but if X has subjective certainty that P, X thinks she knows that P. That's my suggestion. Now, I do have some textual evidence for this interpretation. Professor Joas makes the connection with knowledge explicit at various points, for example, in the following quotation. A commitment to values, he writes, may stem from experiences that fill us with enthusiasm. When we have a sense of having clearly recognized what is good, we feel the urge to bestow this knowledge on others, to get them to rethink or change how they act. End quote. So to be subjectively certain, I'm suggesting, is just to think that you know. And in the case that interests us, it would be to think that you know that all persons are equal in dignity and rights, as well as to know some of the requirements of justice that this places us under, that we must not torture, that people are entitled to a democratic society, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not sure how this relates to the alternative gloss he provides for this mark in terms of subjective self-evidence. Some construals of this term will bring it closer to subjective certainty, and others will put a considerable distance between the two of them. at the greatest distance, and I'm sure this is not what he intends, would be to think of self-evidence in the way that we think of the self-evidence of certain a priori truths. Here, the way we think of evidence is as an epistemic property. It's that in virtue of which we know or can come to know some fact. So A is evidence for B if A gives us some reason to believe that B. Saying that some truth is self-evident is to claim that it needs no further support from outside itself. It's self-justifying. So to understand the claim in question is already to be in a position to know it. I think this sense is a poor fit with Professor Joas's treatment of this subject. First off, he treats self-evidence and certainty as synonymous, but self-evidence and certainty are clearly different on this construal. Among the things I can be certain about, the self-evident is a small and special class. Most things known fall outside of it. For example, I can be certain that inequality concentrated within the top percent of the population, top 1%, exploded in the U.S. starting in the 1970s. Indeed, I am certain of that, because I've read the scholarship by Piketty and Sayez that demonstrates this fact. But this is obviously not a self-evident proposition. Economists denied it for a long time without being confused, although they certainly were mistaken and may have been irresponsible. Furthermore, Professor Joas wants to argue that we acquire the value of human rights through powerful experiences, especially the experience of trauma. But what we come to know through experience is not something that's self-evident. I don't need experience to teach me what is self-evident. Similarly, he is explicit that he does not consider the question of the justification of human rights claims as moot or irrelevant, as they would have to be if they were self-justifying. Indeed, the very project of affirmative genealogy is meant to provide a kind of historical and contingent justification of human rights. And in Chapter 5, he presents some striking religious justifications for the value of the person, to which I will return below. So I want to set aside the self-justifying interpretation and focus on a more plausible candidate that fits better with the main themes of his argument. Here I start by noticing that experience often makes things evident to us. For example, having experienced the first hour of the faculty meeting, it can be evident to me that the discussion is going nowhere. Or, to use one of Professor Joas's central cases, when the Quakers heard the testimony of former slaves about the horrors of slavery, the injustice of the institution was evident to them. Here, for something to be evident is for it to be apparent, to be clear, to be manifest. Perhaps everything we're certain of is evident to us. Or maybe not everything that we're certain of is clear and manifest, but at least many of the things are, I suppose. So the two are rather closely related. So I take it this construal fits better both the central role he wishes to grant experience, especially the experience of trauma, and his equation of self-evidence with certainty. So what might the subjective and subjective self-evidence mean? I suppose it might mean the same as subjective and subjective certainty. That is, it might just mean the individual thinks that something is evident, although she might be wrong. Or I suppose it may be intended to emphasize that different subjects might share an experience, but have different things made evident to them by it. For example, at my faculty meeting, a brand new member of the department might not be in a position to realize that the discussion was going nowhere, although it was obvious to me. Indeed, her different knowledge and orientation might make something else manifest to her. For example, that someone was being a bully in a subtle way. Indeed, he might be intending subjective to mark a union of these two. In that case, X finds something subjectively self-evident when she thinks that she knows it because experience made it clear to her. All right. With these suggestions on the table, I'm in a position to raise the question I want to raise. So, to review, on Professor Joas's account, someone holds something, a value, sacred, if she satisfies two conditions with respect to it. The first is that she thinks she knows the relevant normative or evaluative claims associated with the value, and perhaps thinks they are evident to her as the result of experience. And furthermore, she feels strongly about these claims. Now, this seems to me like a fair, if anodyne, account of what it is to value something. So, for example, if I value democracy, I must at the very least think I know something, some normative claims about it. For instance, that it is good, that democracy is good, and perhaps that undemocratic forms of government are unfair, at the very least. But this obviously isn't enough, for I can hardly be said to value democracy if those claims leave me cold. I must thus also care or be passionate about them. So the two marks seem to capture what it is to value something fairly well. But this is precisely the source of my worry. Thinking you know some normative or evaluative claim and feeling strongly about it seems to me to define something significantly more general than holding something to be sacred. Indeed, the marks are so thin that I don't see how the specific quality of the sacred is captured in the definition at all. My worry is that the more general thing the definition captures is holding something to be a value, of which there may, holding something to be a value, and that holding something to be sacred is actually a special case of this. It's one way of having a value, of which there may be others. Now, I should say that I'm in a very weak place here in the following sense. I don't have a theory of the sacred to offer, so I'm really out on a limb here. But it seems to me that holding a value to be sacred probably involves thinking of the evaluative or normative claim in question as grounded in some feature of our relation to the divine, or if that's too specific, to the spiritual or to the transcendent. We heard that note in the emphasis on experience of the transcendent before. But let me relate this skeptical thought to Professor Joas's own arguments. In his generous, circumspect, and fascinating 5th chapter, I think it's probably my favorite chapter in the book, he offers precisely what I am suggesting is needed to get us from holding a value in general to thinking of it as sacred. He offers a ground for the dignity of the human person in our relation to the divine. In particular, he justifies the high status of the human person by, first, appeal to our possession of an immortal soul, and second, by appeal to the claim that our life is a gift from our Creator. Now, someone who grounds human rights in this way, by relation to the divine, will thereby not only hold the relevant values, but hold them in a certain way, namely, by viewing them as sacred. As bearers of immortal souls or recipients of the gift of life, persons are, on this view, indeed sacred. However, Professor Joas is clear that this is a ground for those who are religious in their orientation, and indeed, specifically Christian. He does not aim there to convince those who are not religious, or to argue that this is the only possible justification of human rights. Those of us who do not believe in an immortal soul, or that life is a gift, and so do not accept such a foundation, religious foundation for human rights, may still hold that persons have dignity and equality that defines a very high status, placing the most stringent requirements of justice on one another. However, since we do not ground the status in our relation to the divine, we do not thereby hold persons to be sacred. We value human rights without thinking of them in this way. But of course, if this is right, then the genesis of human rights is not the sacralization of the person. Or rather, not only that, except, and this is a pretty huge exception, except insofar as religious justifications have had and continue to have a role in creating and sustaining human rights. Thank you.
Well, I too want to thank Professor Joas and the organizers of this event for the invitation to respond to this fine book, The Sacredness of the Human Person. It's also a delight to be part of this esteemed panel, and I thank each of you for coming today. How then to proceed? I want first to begin with some points of agreement. I note these points of agreement not in order to forefront my own work, but to think with Joas and to illustrate how agreement about human value can transpire, which is, of course, one purpose of the book. Agreements in hand, I will turn to raise, predictably, some theological and ethical questions meant to advance the argument. Among the many points with which I agree in Joas's book, let me isolate 3 or 4 that are absolutely central and salient to our discussion today. The first is the importance of interpretation, experience, and action in the book. Values, Joas tells us, are the articulation of experiences, and in his affirmative Genealogy of Human Rights, Joas places importance on, as we've already heard, quote, subjective certainty, the sense of self-evidence, and effective intensity of the kind characteristic of the sacred. He then contends that when we experience a value, we experience its validity and thus an obligation to recognize it. What is more, he offers an account of value generalization that details how values within and among diverse religious and cultural legacies can gain universal status, like what he calls the sacredness of the person. I'll return to the sacred later, but here I agree with the task of value generalization and see in Joas's case how this seeks to respond to the challenge left to us by the great Ernst Troeltsch. The challenge is how to make universal claims about values and norms in a world of moral, cultural, and religious diversity that is the mark of the course of history. Joas's affirmative genealogy seeks to trace within specific cultural, mainly European and American, and religious, mainly Christian, sources out to a generalization of the value of human beings as such. In this way, he moves from particular resources in history to show the generalization of human rights. Yet he does not assume that Christian faith alone can justify human rights, or that one cannot find lucid analogs in other traditions. Now, in various writings myself, I've called this strategy hermeneutical realism, and I've sought to show how it avoids the now exhausted debate between moral particularists and moral universalists. Hermeneutical realism does so by preserving the necessity of interpreting particular resources, but with an eye to general norms and values for the responsible life. One must also admit that others will use different linguistic, symbolic, and practical resources to make analogous claims about the good of the integrity of life. The intellectual's job, and I think this is what Joas is engaged in this book, is to further the work of reinterpretation and value transformation of a tradition for the sake of broadly shared human goods. A second point of agreement flows from the first. Joas's task is to show how and in what ways traditions, especially the Christian tradition, undergo value transformations such that what was not self-evident or effectively intense can become so. In part, this is what Paul Ricoeur called a hermeneutics of retrieval, which Joas undertakes with respect to the soul, life after death, and human life as created by God. Yet this also requires that one admit that one's tradition is internally complex, as well as interpreted differently at different times and in different places. As shown with the examples of punishment and slavery in the book, Christians have not always unambiguously affirmed human rights or human value. Many do not affirm them today. Joas's work advances value transformation. Truth-seeking and not dogmatic certainty is the aim of this kind of hermeneutical reflection. Now, here too I see parallels to my concerns. I've called the work of transforming a tradition from inside the labor of radical interpretation. And I've done so with a normative commitment to respect and enhance the integrity of life, especially human life. Whereas Jonas speaks of the sacredness of the person, I have been concerned with what I call theological humanism. The salient difference between these normative outlooks will arise in the questions I oppose in a few moments. Another point of agreement. Joas is known for his work on and use of classical pragmatists, James Dewey, particularly Mead, as well as Talcott Parsons' thought. Like them, he stresses experience as a reflexive relation between an organism, or an individual, and its social and natural environments. Joas is keen to show how values are to be understood as motives for action, including the feeling of obligation. Value commitments, as he called them, are held differently than opinions or rationally justified claims, and yet follow what he calls a logic of communication about value, unquote. Yet I also think that the book shows the normative reason for adopting the pragmatic focus on experience. In other words, I'm reading this text as making a normative proposal as well. The sacredness of the person normatively determines the philosophical and sociological approaches Joas adopts, modifies, and deploys in his affirmative genealogy of human rights. This is why I think his volume, The Genesis of Value, is fronted with the quote, "Properly speaking, there is no certitude. All there is men who are certain." Human actions and relations, as well as experience, has been basic in my own work, which has sought within ethics an analogous return to human life, in and through the importance of language in so much postmodern thought. The turn to language, despite its great gains, has saddled us with a conflict between moral particularists focused on what Alistair MacIntyre calls tradition-constituted rationality, on the one hand, and more universalist positions rooted in communicative action, such as Jürgen Habermas's. Joas nicely puts the point, quote, "An experientialist approach does not assume that we can access experiences without a symbolic medium. By the same token, insofar as we are interested in value generalizations, moral rationalism as well as moral particularism are simply inadequate to express our experiences." So we're back to the hermeneutic strategy of the book that includes the linking of justificatory arguments and history, because there is no purely rational justification of values. Now, with all of this agreement in hand, and other points could be noted, what is left for me to fulfill that sacred, solemn duty of the academic respondent? That is, to criticize and question. To be honest, some of those points have began to emerge, and I want to try to isolate them in the time I have remaining. So what are the points in question? The first has to do with human motivation. Joas is right, I think, to understand that value motivates action differently than rational argument might motivate agreement or consensus. Yet when we start to explore how and why values motivate, some differences come to the fore. Recall that for Joas, values have subjective certainty, the sense of self-evidence, and affective intensity of the kind characteristic of the sacred. The compelling force of a value arises within the history and social relations of peoples. This means, as he argues, that Christian ideas about the soul as immortal and securing the worth of the person, and the idea of life as a gift flowing out of beliefs about people as the children of God, can incur obligations that limit, quote, our disposal over ourselves, unquote. These ideas of worth and obligation are the background to the modern conception of the self and human rights in this book. So the worth of people and obligations that limit self-disposal come to have a self-evident and effective intensity that can motivate behavior and secure commitment. We should note that this strategy is tinged with Kantianism via Troeltsch and Troeltsch's idea of the person. Kant argued that what we find holy, and undoubtedly so, is humanity in our persons. While hardly a Kantian, since Joas rightly denies a purely rational justification of value of the person qua person, for Joas, what is it to motivate human beings to commit to human rights? Two problems arise at this point, at least for me. First, I think Joas's argument about motivation cries out for a more robust and naturalistic account of human needs and goods in order to clarify when sacredness of the person is respected and enhanced, or when it is demeaned and harmed. This is not the time or place to develop such an account, but one could do so by drawing on an Aristotle, Aquinas, a Schleiermacher, a Ricoeur, or many others. I think Troeltsch also in some respects. In other words, the universe of human values are not keyed only to tradition and experiences of self-evidence, but also through the needs that mark our incarnate, social, reflective, and moral lives. That judgment leads to the second problem with respect to motivation. I worry that such a blanket conception of human worth thwarts the precision we need in order to navigate difficult and at sometimes tragic decisions, say in hospitals or in the realities of war. Stated otherwise, does this argument finally entail a claim about reverence for human life or the sanctity of human life that could actually limit the possibility of obligations that we have to protect the rights of others in conflict situations? So a question about motivation flows out into a theoretical dispute about goods and also a practical question about moral judgments in specific cases. Second, I have an ethical and theological question about the connection between soul, self, and human rights. Importantly, in classical Christian thought, say Augustine or Aquinas, as well as Luther, Calvin, and others, it is crucial that only the soul can harm itself. That is, only the soul can sin. Other people and forces might coerce or harm one into wrongful acts, but sin resides in the inner man, to use old language. This is why redemption, which along with sin is not mentioned in the book, is crucial to Christian faith. Grace must come from God, even if human beings can cooperate with divine grace. Now, my point here is not to enter into soteriology, that is, discourse about salvation, but to note a possible incongruity between traditional Christian thought and modern conceptions of the self. We are much more aware, as Jonas's fascinating chapters on punishment and slavery show, we are much more aware of how the self can be damaged, violated, traumatized into the very core of one's being. This is another reason why I think we need a more robust and naturalistic account of human goods to sustain human rights. How do we know what to defend, what to esteem in human beings without some idea of those goods of integral flourishing? This entails a very different idea of harm than traditional ideas about the soul. So here we come upon a paradox as Christian thought moves into the modern world. On the one hand, the sacrality of the person must be protected by human rights regimes, but insofar as the idea of the self relies on the idea of an immortal soul, it does not need to be protected, since only God and the inner man can violate it. The second question, then, is about the different conceptions of human rights required by the idea of the soul and the idea of the person. An affirmative genealogy, a hermeneutics of retrieval, obviously will be about innovations and changes in traditions, as Joas rightly insists. But it must also note what cannot be retrieved or transformed for good or ill. In terms of the problem of harm, the idea of an immortal soul and that of the modern self cannot accommodate the same conceptual or psychic range. A third question. Joas's affirmative genealogy focuses intensely on life as a gift and the soul or image of God, so much so that the distinctive Christian conception of the human condition might be elided. To put it in Pauline language, human beings are in bondage to the law of sin and death, and Christ is the one who liberates human beings. The suggestion here is that folks might actually be served by a deeper engagement with the manifold symbols, narratives, metaphors in a tradition in relationship to human discourse, rather than simply soul and life as a gift. Now, I suspect that Joas would say that that's the work of the theologian or ethicist to do, and that he is engaged in social thought and sociology. Well, points taken. But my real issue is a methodological one, namely, to what extent must the link between justificatory arguments and history be mediated by a more complex hermeneutical reflection on the primary symbols, narratives, and metaphors of the tradition being charted? This is about the inevitable self-positioning of the historian or the thinker, as Joas stresses, but also and crucially how we come to recognize the obligations in value experiences and their universal character. At issue then is a question about moral and religious epistemology. Let me pose one last theological and ethical question. While it is true that certain Christian conceptions of perfection or theosis are about the divinization of the human person, such claims have had, at best, an ambiguous legacy in modern social and philosophical thought. Nietzsche could argue about the self-overcoming of man in the Übermensch. Some current French thinkers champion the idea of man becoming God, and ideas about the sanctity of life migrate sanctity from the divine to the finite. All of these positions risk, theologically considered, an inflation of human worth at the cost of affirming our finitude. This might be, oddly enough, a new kind of nihilism. We cannot value the finite unless we make it sacred or divine. Yet, as Ricoeur once noted, we are human, only human. In the same way, the picture of God as all-loving and human life devoid of sin or the need of redemption seems to make God a servant of human flourishing and the realm of created value, oddly constricted to a narrow anthropocentrism. Joas's text, I worry, tends in both of these directions. And that is why I have always preferred to speak of theological humanism rather than the sacredness of persons, in order to champion the integrity of life, including non-human life, within a humanistic stance. In conclusion, I want to thank Hans Joas for writing such an engaging book. I've tried to isolate points of overlap and therefore to enact his claims about value generalization. But also I've thought to pose my own theological and ethical concerns. Yet for those of us who do not pit Christianity against modernity, those of us who believe that hard-fought battles to respect and enhance the integrity of human life are battles that Christians too must join, for those of us who believe that religious discourse can provide insight into the structures of lived reality in order to orient human life, for those of us like myself, we can only appreciate and applaud the purposes and insights of this book. Thank you.
Briefly.
Yes, 10 minutes according to the program. So I'm immensely grateful to all three panelists, and I will, of course, be very selective in my reaction. It doesn't make sense to address all individual points. I deal with the three panelists in this sequence in which they made their presentation. So, John Kelly first. I mean, you are certainly right in one respect, that this book about human rights is, let's say, not global enough. I think what we really would need is a kind of global history, now in my terms, of moral universalism or something like that, and not just starting in the 18th century, but, for example, starting in the axial age. So I can say that at least two of my publications after finishing this somehow point in this direction, namely the volume on the axial age I edited with Robert Bella and my own contribution to that. And I recently wrote something that will come out soon on slavery and torture in a global perspective. And I will just illustrate the relevance of that by saying, for example, whereas I speak about the abolition of torture in Europe in the 18th century in the book, I've not dealt with the fact that the European powers did not abolish torture in their own colonies. Yeah, if you think it was, let's say, a value-rational commitment to the abolition of torture, they would have abolished torture in the colonies as well. But the use of torture in the colonies even intensified in the 20th century. In Algeria and Kenya, to mention two of the most outrageous cases, and at the same time, for example, when Britain and France contributed to European human rights pacts, they tortured not just individual informers or something like that, terrorists, but whole populations, you could say, in these two countries. So you're right with regard to that. I have a brief methodological point with your using the index of my book as a source for my preferences. You would have to look at least also in the index of other books to make such strong, to draw such strong conclusions from that. And whether we really disagree with regard to relativity and universalism, I'm not so sure. But your main part, and I will only focus on that, was on Durkheim. That is remarkable because, for example, in the second discussion volume on the book that I mentioned, 3 of the chapters deal with my interpretation of Durkheim and contradict each other completely. Now, your most critical point was that I said Durkheim didn't have a theory of a sacralization process. I realized that this statement is ambiguous. I think he had a theory of, let's say, a situated emergence of sacredness. No question. That's one of the most interesting aspects of his book on the elementary forms. But he does not have a theory of drawn-out processes of sacralization. What happened in the 18th century with regard to torture or something like that. I mean, he knows something about that. But one cannot call this a theory. I wrote in another book, Durkheim never returned from Australia, if you understand what I mean by that. I mean, he studied the Australian Aborigines because he wanted to draw conclusions from that for the study of the present. And he drew the conclusions, but he jumped over the whole history between religion in tribal societies and, let's say, if you want to use that term, and the 20th century. And you had several other points. I disagree with your emphasis on Durkheim considering social phenomena, social processes as facts. I agree with Torquat Parsons, who has already in the structure of social action tried to demonstrate that this was a certain phase in Durkheim's development when he published the rules of the sociological method, but in his study of morality and religion got beyond that. You mentioned Habermas, and my critique of this, I really think, completely misguided idea of an ongoing process of the linguistification of the sacred. Now, Habermas has changed his mind in the introduction to his last collection of essays, Post-Metaphysical Thought 2. He has explicitly declared that he no longer defends the earlier idea. The strange thing is that he retains the terminology. He still speaks about the linguistification of the sacred, but now this has a different meaning from what it had in his theory of communicative action. And what you said about sacralization of the property, I just want to make clear that sacralization of the person is one possible sacralization. There are dozens of possible sacralizations. I mentioned the sacralization of the nation. And of course you can say the sacralization of property and of many other phenomena. So I'm not saying human rights is the history of sacralization, but the history of the sacralization of something very, very special, very improbable, you could say, namely the sacralization of the person. Now, Ben Laurence, I mean, to be honest, I felt a little bit misunderstood in several respects. It started early in the paper when you quote me as, and I mean, we don't have time, it's on page 2 of your paper, where I say the sacred can either newly emerge or be transferred and migrate. And in the very first sentence of your interpretation, you ignore that I say can newly emerge, and treat my argument as if I had said the sacred can only be transferred and migrate. But that's a different theory, so to speak. That goes somehow back to Marc Bloch, and has been taken up by Muna Ouzuf. And that is exactly not my theory, since I'm mostly interested in these processes of the emergence of something new. Although, of course, there are also processes of migration and transfer. Now, what you say about certainty and self-evidence, or subjective self-evidence, that's important, because I try to describe that we, for ourselves, experience certain things as not being in need of rational justification. That does not mean that we shouldn't justify them. Just if we are honest with ourselves, we don't believe that we will ever be convinced by the other, that our most profound convictions have to be changed. That's all I'm saying at this point. And they are not identical, because of course there are other forms of certainty. Like your example, I'm certain, because I have read several books on this topic, I'm certain that this is true, but that has nothing to do, that's a purely rational certainty. That has nothing to do with this experiential self-evidence. This is clear to me. To sexually abuse children is evil. The Holocaust is evil. Without me ever having developed an argument why this is the case. Now, the last point where I really would say I feel misunderstood is where I say a value is sacred. No. What I'm saying is, on the basis of the experience of sacredness, one of the possible articulations of this experience is to make a propositional statement about the good. So not this propositional statement is sacred, but the experiential basis of that. And I may even change my, let's say, rational articulation of that without losing the connection to this experiential basis. So I don't say the values are sacred. And so at the end, the conclusion, of course, in your case is for religious people, certain things are sacred. For non-religious people, they are not sacred. That's, of course, the opposite of what I am saying. And we would have to have, let's say, a communication. For example, I would like to ask you, why is the ideal society a crucial topic of your philosophical work? And I'm rather confident that when you answer this question, and when I ask you, from when on did you have this interest, that we would find certain elements in your biographical experience that motivate you to follow this particular course in your philosophical work. And then I would say, yeah, this, what we have now identified, has something to do with the experiential qualities I call sacred. Now, Bill Schweiker, I'm very proud that one of the world's leading theological ethicists agrees with me on so many points, and I think it's correct. It's not even agreement can be based on a misunderstanding. But I think, no, it's true, there are obvious, different terminologies, so to speak, but clear similarities and affinities, and I found it attractive that you characterize your own contribution as a case of value generalization also. There is a small, let's say, terminological difference that may indicate a difference in our thinking, but I'm not sure. Namely, like Ben Laurence speaking about values as sacred, you say values motivate, or you ascribe to me the assumption that values motivate. Again, that's not exactly what I'm saying. I can't imagine that the propositional statement, this is good, motivates you.
No, I mean experience.
Yes, what I'm saying is the holistic experience that leads to our value commitments is characterized not by a clear separation of insight and motivation. The experience of the sacred is both something that has to be cognitively articulated and deeply motivating. And that is, for example, I know, for example, from conversation with Habermas, that he tends to say, for example, your theory in the genesis of values is good for the question of moral motivation, but has nothing to do with the question of moral insight, so to speak. And so I think he misses the point that I'm saying the holistic experience is both. You cannot apply the dualistic distinction to that. But now one last point that seems to me to be important, and that is important for our communication, but also for the communication between Ben Laurence and myself. You were both speaking on chapter 5 of my book. And I have to briefly, I didn't say anything about that chapter in the introduction. So I feel the need to briefly characterize, let's say, the logical status of that chapter. For those who haven't read the book, I say the first 3 chapters, the historical, sociological chapters, deny that we can trace back human rights to Christian roots. So it would be totally self-contradictory if the 5th chapter then demonstrated the Christian roots of human rights. What I'm doing in the 5th chapter is something totally different. I say, when such a new thing like the commitment to human rights comes into the world, all religious and non-religious traditions have to accommodate. They have to say, either are we now in favor of this innovation or are we against it? And they will articulate it in the form of saying, this is, or in a spectrum of course, this is exactly what we have always already tried to say without saying it, or this is totally against what we have always said. And you find the whole spectrum, I would say, in all religious traditions. Now what I do in the chapter is, I say, let's look, one could almost say empirically, at how Christians who are in favor of human rights say what in their religious tradition can retrospectively be interpreted as a preparation of human rights. And these, I claim, are the 2 things, the notion of the soul and the notion of our life as a gift. And I just wanted to be honest, so to speak, writing this book as a Christian who denies the Christian historical roots, to say now how can I, as a Christian, refer to this? If I were Jewish, I would have had to write a different chapter. If I were a Muslim, I would have had to write a different chapter. So I do not claim that finally in chapter 5 I offer the foundations. But I say it's one of the possibilities to reintegrate or to integrate a historical innovation into an older, in this case, traditional religious, but not necessarily religious framework. Now, last sentence is, I think what you miss, Bill, is, let's say, a Christian elaboration of that. Since, I mean, I fully agree with you that the important thing are not these 2 abstractions. The important thing in a religious tradition are not the 2 abstractions, but symbols, as you say, narratives, metaphors. That's exactly what I think. But, you know, a theological elaboration would indeed not have been the point in the book. It's a kind of, it's an element in a construction, and every individual, let's say, believer or non-believer and thinker would have to offer a much more comprehensive foundation. And I couldn't have offered a more, let's say, theological interpretation at that point, because that would have contradicted my purpose of speaking about human rights as something believers and non-believers share. So, of course, in that sense, it's only a common denominator, and that's why I've written this in this gesture. Even you who don't believe in God can try to understand the idea of life as a gift, like Michael Sandel, and to some extent Habermas, in bioethical debates. have done. So don't treat the idea of life as a gift as nonsense just because you don't believe in a creator. There remains some deep meaning in this assumption, even for non-believers, so to speak. So that's the construction, and I think that explains to a large extent why certain things that you are missing are missing.